And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, March 18th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, a major reboot of the government's small innovation programs is finally moving after months of uncertainty. Plus, new limits on executive pay and dividends are changing expectations across the defense sector, even if the effects haven't hit earnings yet. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. President Trump promised that he would wage a war on fraud at his State of the Union address, and now those plans are coming into focus. A new executive order calls on nearly a dozen benefits-paying agencies to come up with ways to reduce fraudulent payments. Vice President J.D. Vance will lead the task force. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman joins me with more details. Jory, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
All right, let's dig into the details. Which agencies are on this task force, and what will they be doing?
Yeah, so in no particular order, this task force will have the Departments of Treasury, Justice, Agriculture, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security, and also will have the Small Business Administration and the Office of Management and Budget also in that task force. And broadly speaking, what they'll be doing is they'll be working together to come up with a national strategy to stop fraud, waste, and abuse within federal benefit programs.
Do they have a number target that they're going after?
That can be a squishy thing to nail down. There's a figure out there from the GAO and IGs of the world on improper payments, and that's not exactly a one-to-one. Improper payments includes all number of payments. Some of them are overpayments, some of them are underpayments, but the Government Accountability Office has nailed down an estimate of the fraud number, and that is somewhere in the neighborhood of $233 billion, upwards of $521 billion annually lost to fraud. But at this White House signing ceremony of this executive order on Monday, White House officials suggested that the task force could actually recover more money than what GAO estimates. White House Staff Secretary Will Scharf said that this could recover billions or tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars. And Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller went beyond that and said that this could be an effort to ultimately recover trillions of dollars. President Donald Trump said that the recovery of these funds really would be a country-changing amount of money, said it could do things like address the national debt and ultimately lower taxes for a lot of Americans.
If we found half of the fraud that's taking place in this country, and I think you have a chance of doing that, we would have much more than a balanced budget. That's the kind of numbers you're talking about. The theft is incredible.
Those numbers are pretty ambitious. What kind of problems are they starting with?
Yeah, so we heard from Vice President J.D. Vance, who will be leading this task force. He said that as the fraud czar appointed by this executive order, he would really make sure that agencies primarily are on the same page, that they are on the same wavelength when it comes to, seeing end-to-end fraud investigations be prosecuted and come to an end.
We started to figure out one big hole that existed is that the agencies of the government weren't actually talking to each other. So Treasury would have evidence of financial fraud, but wasn't talking to the Department of Justice about it. Health and Human Services had evidence of Medicaid fraud, but wasn't talking to the Department of Treasury about it. So what this executive order does is force the entire apparatus of the federal government to do two things: stop the fraud in the American taxpayer and make sure that the benefits that ought by right go to American citizens and not to fraudsters.
Jory, how are they going to actually do that? Do they have some near-term goals?
Yeah, so within the next 30 days, the agencies on this task force, they are on the hook to identify which of their benefits programs and transactions are the most susceptible to fraud schemes and to suggest some fraud prevention remedies. And the remedies outlined in this executive order are pretty extraordinary here. They said that in some cases, agencies may need to proactively pause certain types of funding until there are additional controls that can be put in place. The Trump administration has already done that to some effect. They recently paused hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicare payments to the state of Minnesota, citing widespread fraud concerns that they have highlighted. But that's a pretty extraordinary measure to preemptively say that all of this money is fraud, and we have to close the spigot until we take a closer look at what's going on here. And then there are some other more conventional ideas here, really just making sure that there is some data sharing in place to make sure that agencies are doing all they can to flag and identify potentially fraudulent payments before they're paid out. That is the gold standard for any government CFO or IG that you speak to.
Jory, there's always been some tension in these kinds of benefit programs between making them easy for beneficiaries to use and access versus putting up high walls around accessibility that would help deter fraudsters. So have they said anything about where that balance is going to lie?
Well, that is a tricky balance, and we've seen in recent years some struggle to manage that balance. You saw back in 2020, some of the COVID pandemic relief programs, agencies were really focused on getting the money out the door above all else. And so there were fewer of those checks in place to make sure that they were doing all they could to mitigate fraud before payments were issued. That was one recent example. And another thing that comes to mind is, of course, the Department of Government Efficiency, something we saw in the earlier days of the Trump administration, where these DOJ officials came in, said that they were going to largely cut out fraud, waste, and abuse in government spending. They had an ambitious target as well. They were looking to get about $2 trillion in fraudulent and wasteful spending out of government. And if you take Elon Musk, his word for it, the former DOJ leader, he said that DOJ was somewhat successful at the end of last year and that DOJ ultimately cut somewhere in the neighborhood of about $200 billion in payments.
So as this fraud task force gets up and running, what other administration initiatives will they build on?
One other thing to think about here is what we saw last year is that the Trump administration signed an executive order trying to promote more of the data sharing between these agencies, trying to make sure there's greater coordination. One great example is the Treasury Department's Do Not Pay data set and the Social Security Administration's Death Master File. Those agencies now have more access to those data sets. They can cross-reference those to ultimately avoid sending improper payments to deceased individuals, people who, of course, no longer need those benefits. That's one major effort. And again, there was some concern about kind of where exactly the focus of this fraud task force will be, having mentioned things like the situation in Minnesota. Trump did try to get ahead of this a bit, saying that this is going to be a nationwide problem, that they're going to look at fraud in red states as well, if they have evidence of that being the case. But he did then immediately follow up and say that this is a problem that happens heavily in Democratic states. And the executive order does call out a number of states, such as California, Illinois, New York, Maine, Minnesota, and Colorado. So a bit of a mixed bag there.
Will the task force have a regular reporting schedule so that the public can find out how well they're doing?
There's not necessarily a sense of when the scheduled meetings will be, but you can expect a regular cadence of these agencies meeting, coordinating, comparing notes, seeing where the gaps are and where they need to go in order to bring this national strategy together and to do the kind of things that this executive order sets out to do. That's
Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for the story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find the full details at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, new limits on executive pay and dividends are changing expectations across the defense sector, even if the effects haven't hit earnings yet. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The administration's new rules on executive pay, dividends, and other financial tools haven't moved defense earnings, but they're already reshaping how companies think about future contracts. Those limits could eventually influence everything from talent pipelines to supply chain stability as they get written into deals over the coming year. We get the latest market signals and industry reactions from Paul Murphy of Bloomberg Government. Paul, it's great to have you back on the show.
Terry, it's great to be here.
I know you've been tracking how the new limits on executive pay and dividends and other financial levers are landing across the defense sector. Now that we're a little bit removed from that announcement, what, if anything, are you seeing in defense stock performance?
Well, Terry, let's back up a second and just refresh people's memory that I think we're talking about this executive order that hit back in January, right before earnings season, as it turns out. This prioritizing the warfighter in defense contracting, and it allows Secretary Hegseth to restrict stock buybacks, dividends, certain types of executive compensation through future defense contracts. It doesn't impose explicit universal compensation caps, but it's requiring these terms to be embedded in contracts. So it's not going to be anything that's criminal or regulatory in nature. It's going to be contract based, so it's future oriented. So really, since it hit in January, it hit before earnings seasons, and a lot of the companies had already been reporting about dividend payments back in the October, December timeframe. We really haven't seen a big hit in the defense industry just yet, and the stocks are fairly stable. And in fact, the big primes toward the end of the year were several of them were reporting record revenues for last year, and a lot of, as you've seen, a lot of big ticket opportunities, contracts are hitting right now, and so the defense market is looking pretty strong.
One of the open questions about that compensation cap might be on a company's ability to recruit and keep senior tech talent. Are you seeing any kind of response to that in terms of movement and retention or morale or hiring at these firms?
Again, it's still a little early. At the Davos meeting in Switzerland, the big international financial meeting, Secretary Bessent, Treasury Secretary Bessent, he lambasted defense executives, saying their companies have let the American people down. They're years behind on their contracts when CEOs are making $30 to $50 million a year. So there's likely, some discomfort at the executive level, but we aren't seeing people heading for the exits just yet. The EO targets the C-suite, CFOs, CEOs, but it's largely avoiding the mid-tier, the higher paid engineers at these companies. So it may have a long-term cultural effect in terms of the kinds of incentives they can offer, the salaried employees and the higher level tech talent. And if that's the case, we may, see, engineers being more attracted to, civilian opportunities in the coming months. But so far, none of the companies have been cited for underperformance. I understand early reports are that they are in negotiations with some companies that have been reported to be underperforming. I mean, Lockheed had a big issue with the Lot 15 F-35s, and President Trump explicitly called out RTX for slow delivery of the Patriots. But apparently they're in negotiations about some of these problems. And you see Secretary Hegseth was right there in St. Louis this week, touting Boeing's move to St. Louis out of Arlington. And so I think they are trying to help these defense contractors succeed. They're not doing right now a lot of the announcements that the underperformance announcements that the executive order called for.
So you think the companies are taking kind of a wait and see approach to perhaps restructuring senior compensation models or other sorts of getting ahead of this?
Yeah, and because it's contract focused, as we just discussed, it gives the Defense Department a lot of leverage over how these negotiations play out. It's not a universal across the board cap on salary or cap on profits, or you can't issue dividends. I think companies obviously are still issuing dividends, and I haven't seen major announcements of stock buybacks in the last 2 or 3 months, but so far, there doesn't seem to have been a major change in corporate behavior or in employee behavior.
I'm speaking with Paul Murphy. He's a senior data analyst at Bloomberg Government. Well, Paul, let's shift our angle just a little bit and talk about another segment of government buying around the value-added resellers. This was another big topic towards the end of last year. The administration's been very intentional and a little provocative with the VARs. What are you hearing there in terms of how their behavior is starting to change?
Well, I have my nose in a lot of the data. I'm not the ones necessarily chasing the politicians down the hallway, but we do study the data a lot. And what we're seeing in the data is that there's larger and fewer contracts are going to larger and fewer companies. That's a continuing trend. And the OEM decision to negotiate directly with OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, for the supply of software and equipment is, I think, a big part of this. And we just saw this big award back in January that the Army took Salesforce's Computable Insights subsidiary from a $99 million contract to a $5.6 billion contract. And in the process, they have bypassed scores of resellers and VARs in the Salesforce network. And so this is going to have a significant impact on IT VARs that sold things like Slack, for instance, one of Salesforce's premier products. And it's going to concentrate the sales within the manufacturers. It's a boon to companies like Salesforce, but one of the big losers in this was Carahsoft, which is a big reseller of Salesforce. And so they're going to have to look for other opportunities. They're going to have to continue making the case for reselling to the government. Industry critics are saying that the concentration of the sales power within the OEMs could have deleterious effects down the road because of potential monopoly pricing and a reduction of competition, and just the ability, or once the government buys into a single platform with a single company, it gives that company a lot of leverage. And so it may appear competitive and important for streamlining and efficiency in the short run, but down the road, the concentration of financial power within fewer companies generally has the effect of reducing competition and impacting pricing, which in turn can lead to less value for taxpayers. It could lead to other effects, the inability to buy necessary equipment with the resources that they have to spend for higher priced goods and services.
Part of the discussion around how the government is changing the way it buys is to build resiliency into the supply chain. This sounds like it's actually making the supply chain more fragile.
It's when you concentrate supply in fewer hands, it makes it more fragile. It reduces the amount of competition in the system. It can have that effect, yes.
So you mentioned this particular buy out of the Defense Department. How is that part of the broader OneGov strategy at GSA?
Well, one by one, GSA is approaching a lot of these major IT suppliers, Google, Microsoft, and many others, to bypass the VARs with the idea in mind that products and product-related services can be procured directly from the companies. And there's about, I counted 20 OneGov contracts profiled on GSA's webpage, and that may not even be all of them, because there's another, what they call or classifying as a OneGov contract with Salesforce that didn't actually appear on the site the last time I checked. But it's a strategy that could backfire. The VARs traditionally, they hold the pricing risk. They negotiate volume discounts. Removing them from the supply chain gives the OEM the pricing power, particularly for software. So even though the Pentagon's acquisition reforms encourage direct supplier deals, the model looks like it's going to expand and could lead to higher prices down the road.
So you watch this kind of data all the time. What pieces of data do you have your eye on to kind of tell you where these trends are going to be moving in the short run?
Well, we're watching every day the opportunity notices, and we're watching particularly for single source agreements with companies. We're watching announcements about OEMs and OneGov announcements with OEMs. We are tracking the contracts data very closely. We are seeing trends away from, for instance, small business contracting and socioeconomic set-asides. There's been a lot of pressure on the 8A program, which, through 8A stars and other contracts, has been a significant contributor to competition in the IT and professional services space. But that's where we happen to be seeing the most decline in the number of contractors participating in the federal space. So I think the overall decline in numbers of market participants over time will have a deleterious effect on competition and pricing.
I've been speaking with Paul Murphy. He's a senior data analyst at Bloomberg Government. Paul, really appreciate your update today.
Thanks, Terry. It's good to be with you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, GAO finds persistent gaps and data problems in OMB's federal program inventory, limiting its value for oversight and decision-making. But first, a major reboot of the government's small innovation programs is finally moving after months of uncertainty. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Senate has advanced a bill that would reauthorize the SBIR and STTR programs through 2031 after a long lapse, and it comes with some notable changes for small R&D firms. The package adds tougher foreign risk screening and introduces new Strategic Breakthrough Phase 2 awards that can reach up to $30 million. We'll look at what those shifts mean for innovators and contracting officers with Emily Murphy, former GSA administrator. Emily, great to see you.
It's wonderful to be back with you, Terry.
We have some perhaps good news to start with this morning. It looks like reauthorization for the SBIR-SITR program is going to finally make it through. What are you hearing about that, and what are you noticing about the current proposals?
So we do have good news. The Senate came to a compromise position, and they passed S3971 last week. So they've sent it over to the House. It's being held at the desk, and that suggests that after 5 months of no SBIR authority, we're going to get a reauthorization through. Fingers crossed.
And what is the process then for moving it through the House to finalization?
So it appears that it's being held at the desk in the House, which suggests that they might be bringing it to the floor on suspension of the rules, which means it could be a fairly quick process, and we could have reauthorization done by the end of March. If they refer it to committee, obviously, the House and the Senate have to pass identical pieces of legislation before it can be sent to the president, and that could add more time. But it looks like they came to a good compromise around the security issues around SBIR, around the SBIR mill issue, and frankly, giving us 5 more years of the program rather than a 2-year reauthorization or 1-year reauthorization.
One of the provisions that looks interesting is the creation of a Strategic Breakthrough Phase 2 award. How do you think that will play out?
Well, I think it's really interesting because it only applies to agencies that have over $100 million in extramural R&D already. So most of the agencies that do SBIR aren't going to be affected, but agencies like the Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, Department of War will absolutely, this will apply to them. And it allows for companies that have received at least one successful Phase 2, receive basically a follow-on Phase 2 up to $30 million. But it also requires more matching funds outside of the SBIR program. So it's a way of trying to make sure that to put more funds towards a Phase 2, allow it some time to succeed, but then also make sure that there is really a use for it afterwards. In particular, what's interesting is that within the Department of War, it requires that it actually be a POMmed program already. So it's got to be part of a program of record that's going to be moving forward. So it's trying to bridge that valley of death that we talk about a lot in the SBIR program.
I think people will be looking forward to that. There's also a feature proposed that agencies would have the authority to limit the number of proposals a single firm can submit. Do you see that as an improvement in program integrity?
Well, I think it's an attempt to deal with what's been called the SBIR mill problem. So some members of Congress have been concerned that companies propose multiple times without commercializing. Personally, I've always thought that the way to address this was to actually look at past performance. So there's a story that it took Thomas Edison over 1,000 times of failing before he invented the light bulb. So I'm always reluctant to say, we're going to cap the number of times someone fails at X number. But this seems to be instead an attempt to say, all right, agency by agency, with the ability to have waivers inserted, you can say how many times a company can propose per year, per opening, per topic that's out there, and limit it so that you're getting a diverse group of companies making offers, and it's not the same companies again and again. I do think, though, that it would be wonderful if we started looking at the past performance and whether or not a phase 1 and a phase 2 actually advance the agency's understanding of a topic, and that, using that more as a measure of success. But I think that this is a good proxy, and it's a good compromise that moves the ball forward.
I'm speaking with Emily Murphy. She's Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and a former GSA administrator. Emily, let's change topics a little bit because OMB and GSA have stood up a new acquisition QSMO, Quality Service Management Office, in case folks aren't familiar with that acronym. And it says their goal is to consolidate roughly 230 acquisition systems across the government. Let's start first with how this fits with the administration's other acquisition reform efforts.
So we've already seen the administration come out with several executive orders around acquisition, including one on consolidation of acquisition within GSA of commercial type acquisitions. This is, though, not about actually consolidating the purchases themselves, but the systems that are used for those purchases. And GSA has received now a pre-designation with the idea that they will be later designated as the official QSMO for acquisition systems. It actually makes a lot of sense considering that GSA houses the integrated award environment already, IAE and SAM, that pulls all the data and that has to talk to all those acquisition systems. If successful, this will also give them the ability to do much better data analytics and understanding of where the government has the ability to do more leveraged buying, where there are true commercial purchases that are being made across agencies where you could be aligning requirements better. But it's going to be it's a tough challenge for GSA because we've seen even across other agencies, when agencies try to reduce the number of systems they use internally, that's been a challenge in the past.
Well, this administration has not been shy about saying it wants to consolidate systems. It's made the same announcement regarding HR systems, and it's looking kind of across the board. You've sat in the GSA seat before. Where would you start if you had to consolidate all of these systems?
Well, so the first thing I'd want to do is make sure that the FIBIF, or the Federal Integrated Business Framework, I will say there's some really good acronyms that come into shared services, but making sure that the FIBIF is really up to date, that we've got a very good understanding of the 80% solution for agencies, and that is aligned, and then making sure that the right owner exists within GSA, the right champions, the right sponsorship. I think it's a wonderful sign, though, that Administrator Forrest and Deputy Director Euland are partnering together to work on shared services. When GSA and OMB work together on shared services, you get a lot of progress made.
It does sort of make sense as GSA is looking to consolidate all of the acquisition rules that you might also be able to consolidate the systems that support them.
Yes. And if you've got the fewer deviations you've got, the fewer exceptions to the rules that you have, the easier it is to have a standard set of systems. That said, one of the challenges is going to be, how does assisted acquisition play in this? How do things like multiple award schedules or SOUP play into this? How does GSA's new OCAS, Office of Centralized Acquisition Solutions, how does that play? Because they all have very different models for taking work in. I mean, GSA uses a different acquisition system within the Public Building Service than it does within the Federal Acquisition Service, because construction acquisition looks very different than commercial commodity acquisition. And so trying to make sure that they figured out how to align all of those is going to be challenging. It's got there's great potential there, and it's definitely worth pursuing. And I'm excited to see what they do with it. But they've got a lot of work cut out for them.
Along these lines, GSA's Technology Transformation Services now has a new director. Will this fall on his plate?
It remains to be seen who's going to be designated. I suspect, though, that it's going to be the Systems and Strategy branch within FAS. There's an assistant commissioner there. And that tends to be where GSA puts a lot of its acquisition system launch. It is fascinating to see that the federal CIO coming over and taking over and being co-hatted as the second deputy within FAS, as the director of the Technology Transformation Service. It gives us another indication that we're going to be aligning policy and implementation. And that's an exciting thing to see as well, because that's where you get progress.
Well, so this combination of digital services leadership across the GSA efforts What will you be watching for to see that they're all moving sort of in the same direction at the same pace?
I mean, the first thing we're going to be looking for is, is there an updated FIBIF? Then does the designation follow? Is there this pre-designation happen? Where are we by the end of September? And, has the designation been officially made at that point in time? Is there any direction that's coming out to agencies about spending on acquisition systems? What shows up in the 2027 budget request? Is there anything around the systems there? Is there anything, in the 28 budget request? Because a lot of the question also comes down to how are you going to not just develop the requirements for the systems themselves, but if you want agencies to transition to a system, how are you going to fund that transition?
I've been speaking with Emily Murphy. She's Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Emily, thanks as always. There's a lot to watch here.
It's wonderful to be with you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, GAO finds persistent gaps and data problems in OMB's federal program inventory, limiting its value for oversight and decision-making. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The federal program inventory was meant to give policymakers a clear picture of what the government does and how much it spends. GAO says that picture remains incomplete, with missing programs, outdated listings, and inconsistent data undermining confidence in the site. Here to walk through GAO's findings and what OMB needs to fix is Dawn Locke, Director in GAO's Strategic Issues Team. Ms. Locke, thanks so much for joining me. GAO has a new report out talking about the government's inventory of federal programs. It has been impossible to evaluate government program performance because the government can't actually inventory all of its programs. What makes it so hard to make a comprehensive list here?
Yeah, Terry, actually, we don't know what's making this so difficult or what's slowing down OMB. They have not responded to our questions, nor did they provide comments on our draft report. And GAO, we really acknowledge that this is incredibly complex, especially given the size and scope of the government. We also know there are various challenges that make this effort more difficult that could potentially be slowing things down, including things like inconsistencies or limitations of resources. When it comes to the inconsistencies, I can share with you that this means things like, having common definitions for programs. It's difficult for OMB to collect information when they don't have these common definitions. And a specific example of that, if someone working on the inventory wanted to find all STEM education related programs, they have to know, for example, that some agencies define these programs by calling them mathematics and science partnerships. So it's very difficult. The inconsistencies are all over the board. When it comes to the limited resources that I discussed, they're both people resources and financial resources. For many years, what we can tell, one woman at OMB was trying to tackle the inventory. I believe that she had a FEMA detail helping her for a few months a while ago. We've also suggested that Treasury officials could be brought in to assist, given their expertise in this area, but we're not sure where OMB is with this. And the one woman that was running it has since left OMB last year. And then just to add, when it comes to the financial resources, back in 2021, OMB said that they needed about $20.5 billion to set up the inventory. But what's interesting about this, Terry, is that they never identified this resource in subsequent budget justifications, nor have they ever requested this money. And so one of our recs from a prior report did include identifying the resources needed to fully implement the inventory so all decision makers are on the same page and understand what it will take for OMB to get this done.
Dawn, that is really helpful background. And I want to follow it up because in addition to the resources and people that maybe aren't available to make this happen, your report says that there are complete categories of programs that are missing. There's nothing in here about foreign assistance. There's nothing in here about defense, which is a huge portion of the federal budget. What does that gap mean for policymakers who rely on the inventory?
So it essentially means that they're not getting the complete picture. And the programs that are missing, and some of which that you mentioned, it's about $4 trillion of federal spending is still not included in this inventory. And as you and your listeners know, defense alone makes up almost half of discretionary spending, and there's not a single defense program in this inventory. I will add, if all programs were included, policymakers, decision makers would have better transparency into those programs and could really better identify any potential wasteful or even duplicative spending.
Defense seems like it would be an easy one to add since they have their own programs defined in the POM. What explains why that one's not included?
That is something that we don't know. OMB has not shared that. And to credit OMB, defense is massive, but it's now time for OMB to tackle these massive issues.
One of the other issues that you identify are data quality problems, from inactive programs being listed to missing spending information for the programs that they do have. How does that missing information affect the utility of the website?
Quite simply, Terry, if the data are not reliable, they're not useful. For example, I'll give you a very interesting example. There's a National Railroad Grant Program. It shows obligated amounts that differ by more than $4 billion, depending on where you look on the inventory. In one chart, the program shows that its obligations are at about $6.8 billion. And on another chart, it shows the obligations to be at about $2.4 billion. How is this helpful to users? So without that reliable inventory, there's really no transparency when it comes to how the government is spending our money.
I'm speaking with Dawn Locke. She's a director in GAO's Strategic Issues team. Dawn, let's follow that up because you spoke to 10 organizations who actually try to use the inventory. What sort of feedback did you hear from them?
They are currently trying to use the inventory right now, and their suggestions to us were the same that we were finding. The inventory needs to be complete. It needs to include the remaining programs, such as the ones you mentioned earlier: defense, foreign assistance, acquisition programs, regulatory programs. They also said they need to know how the programs are performing to identify opportunities for improvement. In addition, these user groups suggested it would be helpful to have, for example, geographic information to see where money is being spent, whether it's by state or by congressional district. And they would also value more advanced navigation features, such as things like enhanced search capabilities and filtering functions to more easily search for the information. So Terry, they have these great ideas for the inventory, but OMB is not aware, or at least we're not sure if they're aware. And it really shouldn't take a GAO report to audit them to make them aware. So OMB has to engage with their users.
Dawn, this report does have a standard GAO line. Much progress has been made. OMB has updated the inventory. They have added programs to it, but much remains to be done, and you've made 17 recommendations to OMB. Kind of walk us through the categories of those recommendations.
Yeah, so our recommendations really fall into two categories. One, helping OMB complete the inventory. So 13 of our recommendations just deal with that. When it comes to the inventory not being complete, it's, like I said, it's missing about $4 trillion in spending. So they have to complete the programs, get them all in there, provide performance information, make sure that all the programs that are listed have spending data. And we also recommended that they archive prior years of the inventory because they have not yet done that. The second category of our recommendations deal with ensuring the usefulness of the inventory. And by this, we looked at 5 key practices for helping ensure transparency and usefulness of government websites. And what we found is that OMB really needs to engage with its users, as I mentioned earlier. They fully have to do things like describe the data and define the data. And then they have to lay out the data quality issues for users. For instance, we found inactive programs listed and more than 150 programs listed that didn't have any spending data. So they need to really shore this up.
You said that OMB has not responded to this report, and this administration, OMB, seems to have a bit of an adversarial relationship with GAO. In this case, do you think Congress might take up your recommendations? Are they showing interest in getting a complete inventory of federal programs?
We're really helpful. Although OMB is not collaborating currently as much as they did, we used to have monthly meetings with OMB and had a really great discourse about how to improve and implement this inventory. And even though they're not collaborating as much right now, we are hopeful because of the bipartisan support of this inventory and the importance of this inventory. We're hopeful that things will improve as we go forward.
And if OMB gets this right, what would a complete and reliable program inventory actually enable Congress to do?
Oh, goodness, Terry. So it would give Congress and agency leaders and the public, it would just give us all a transparent view of where the federal dollar is being spent and whether those programs are achieving intended outcomes, because it would include performance information. And then ultimately, it would give all of us the ability to better identify any potential wasteful or duplicative spending.
I've been speaking with Dawn Locke. She's a director in GAO's Strategic Issues team. Dawn, thanks so much for joining me and walking us through this really important report.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Agencies have a new opportunity to get help with modernizing their HR functions. A new HR Shared Services Center from the Office of Personnel Management launched this week. If agencies opt into OPM's offer for a fee, they'll get access to a suite of IT tools to streamline their human capital management capabilities. Here with more details is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
All right. What is OPM offering through its new HR Shared Services Center?
So this is an opportunity that is optional for agencies, and what they would have to do is enter an interagency agreement with OPM. And if they do that, after some onboarding, they'll be able to access various modernization tools for managing things like employee benefits, onboarding, payroll, and performance, as well as more strategic offerings like how to, manage workforce planning and human capital strategy. So it really just covers a whole range of things. There's also going to be tools that agencies can look at for better modernizing how they manage employee compensation, leave, recruitment and retention, time and attendance. So it really just runs the board here.
Folks with long memories might think this feels a little familiar. What does OPM say about why it's launching this initiative now?
So what they're doing for this one is that they essentially say that this is going to fold into President Trump's larger plans of eliminating inefficiencies and duplications in federal services. So the idea here is to streamline things, specifically in HR functions at agencies. OPM, in a memo that it released this week explaining things in more detail, talked about how agencies through this initiative would be able to reduce fragmentation in their HR management tools, and it would also shift some administrative type of work away from HR staff so that they can focus on other areas of their jobs and put more time towards that. They also say this is going to help with saving money and improving what they call HR outcomes across federal agencies. But, one other thing that I think is interesting in the timing here too, and something that OPM referenced in its memo, is that there has been a significant decrease in the HR workforce over the past year because of the Trump administration's broader staffing reduction efforts. We've seen about 7,600 HR managers leave their jobs since Trump's second term began, and that makes it one of the top 10 federal positions that has seen staffing losses this year. So, I think that is notable too. And the way that OPM kind of brought that back around was simply to say that, having these tools streamlined and modernized is going to address the staffing reductions there.
There are some other shared services for HR already in existence. How are those working now, and what does this initiative mean for them?
There are a lot of other similar efforts already in existence, yes, as you said. One of them is called the Quality Service Management Office. There's an HR, quote, QSMO, if you want to use the acronym there. And essentially what that does is the same thing where you have shared services and various offerings for HR management tools that agencies can access, again, if they sign one of these agreements. There are other ones similar from the National Finance Center, Interior Business Center, and Defense Finance and Accounting Service. And all of those are agency payroll providers, but they also similarly offer HR shared services to agencies. So there's, various other options that agencies already have for accessing some of these things. And, these sorts of efforts stretch back at least the last 20 years for, various presidential administrations trying to fix some of the more cumbersome processes in federal HR.
Have there been any interest statements yet from agencies who want to move into OPM's program, and will they come off of one of these other shared services providers to do it?
So what we see in OPM's new memo on this is that there are so far 8 either agencies or components that are going to be part of this initial rollout of OPM's program. So that includes the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, the VA's Inspector General Office, the Office of Government Ethics, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and a couple of others there. So, what we're going to see from them is that it's going to take about 6 months to onboard their current HR processes to be able to, move them over to some of the shared services that OPM is offering. It's not clear if they're already involved in other HR shared services centers. It might be the case that this is just something they're starting for the first time, but it probably depends on the agency there. And I think OPM is hoping or expecting more agencies to join this new office of theirs in the coming months.
OPM itself wasn't unaffected by those staffing drawdowns. Do they have the capacity to run this, or is that something they're going to have to build?
OPM did lose about 1/3 of its entire staff, about 1,000 employees, since President Trump took office. So that's throughout 2025. We've seen very significant staffing reductions within OPM. It's not clear how many of those are specifically in those HR or those kind of technology areas of OPM, but there was at least some reduction there. OPM has said that a lot of its staffing losses were due to either retirements or the deferred resignation program. So, I think it'll be interesting to see how this rolls out and what OPM's capacity will be, especially if you get a lot of agencies interested in these services.
Well, how does this initiative connect with some of the other modernization initiatives that OPM has rolled out recently?
This is one piece of a broader effort from the Trump administration at OPM and what it's calling Federal HR 2.0. So the other significant, effort that we've seen under that initiative is to streamline and consolidate agencies' HR platforms. So right now across government, there are 119 different HR systems that various agencies are using, and OPM, and this is something that for years it's been trying to do, is trying to get all agencies onto just one system, which would of course make things a lot easier for HR staff and for employees transferring between agencies. It's not something that, despite years of effort, has really taken off, but OPM did recently, it's looking to do a contract to create that HR system, and it could be valued at up to $1 billion. So it's going to be a pretty significant shift if that does take place. They're looking to have this roll out by 2027. Not clear if they're going to meet that timeline, but it's something that has been a priority for the agency as well.
So what will you be watching over the next few months to see how these pieces come together?
It'll be interesting to see, especially how this is going to impact HR employees and their workloads. There's, I'm assuming, going to be some sort of training or onboarding involved to get them up to speed on everything, but also just to see how this is going to work between different agencies. For example, if you have employees who move around between them, that could be something that might be helped by a consolidated system. So it'll, I think it'll take time for these things to develop, but definitely interesting to watch here.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her exclusive story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Zandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.